All right, so we'll get going. Everybody loves to be on time, I know, and your time is very precious. So thank you for joining us today. For those of you who have never attended one of our webinars, we're really excited about the one today. So our format changes from month to month. Sometimes we have just a conversation with two folks, which is what we have today, and I'm really excited to introduce our panelist. And sometimes it's a panel of more people, but what stays very consistent is how we like to approach you, the audience, in terms of your questions. So instead of waiting till the very end to do Q&A, we really like to encourage folks to ask questions along the way. So if there's something that's said that's of interest to you, or you have a question in the topic that we haven't addressed yet, please feel free to put your questions either in the Q&A or the chat, depending on whether you want to remain anonymous. So those are sort of the options for you. And please, again, start asking questions as soon as you'd like, and Stacy and I will get to those along the way. We'll just kind of pepper them in throughout the conversation. We typically have a pretty active audience, so don't be shy. Feel free to get your questions in there. So that's the housekeeping. This won't go an hour. Typically, our webinars are anywhere from 30 minutes to 55 minutes, depending on how active you all are and how many questions you have. So we've got a great session about the impact of workplace equity on business performance, ROI, and we're going to hear a lot from Stacy. I'm really excited about Stacy. I'm not introducing her just yet, but the really interesting thing about the context for today's conversation is you've got someone here who really comes at this from three vantage points: from the marketing comms side, from the seat of the CEO, and from the seat of someone sitting on a board. So it's almost like we have three speakers in one with Stacy, which is why I think this is going to be an incredible session. So just to set the stage, we'll talk a little bit about the topic and give you some context, and then we'll move right into a conversation. So the slides are only going to be up for about 5 minutes, and then you're just going to see us. So it's supposed to feel like you can pull up a chair and have a chat. So who are we? Who am I? I'm Maria Colacurcio. I'm the CEO of Syndio. We are a workplace equity analytics platform. We enable companies to analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that are because of something like gender, race, or ethnicity. We currently serve primarily the Fortune 2000, and we have over 300 customers. You can see a bunch of the brands that trust us down there at the bottom. So let's jump in. So I love this opportunity to hear from somebody that's in Stacy's shoes. And I think you'll understand that as we dig into the conversation. But Stacy right now, she's the CMO at Freshworks, but she's really just a stalwart software tech grizzled veteran. Like the rest of us who've sort of been through the ringer, Stacy is absolutely at the utmost of that in terms of her experience. So she's done the growth stage, she's done the build stage, she's done the exit, and this is really with iconic SaaS brands, including SuccessFactors and ServiceMax. At SuccessFactors in particular, Stacy led the team from 10 million in ARR through the company's IPO in 2007. So just a tremendous growth trajectory, and probably learned so much along the way just in terms of that build. But I think what's also interesting is she stayed through the subsequent acquisition by SAP, which was a $3.4 billion acquisition. And then at ServiceMax, Stacy joined the founding team when it was just less than $1 million in ARR, so pretty small in that early stage, and led the marketing function through 6 years of triple-digit growth and a big acquisition by GE. She then served as the CEO of Zinc, a real-time communications app for field service workers, and that was acquired by ServiceMax in 2019. And then she returned to her CMO post there and subsequently joined Freshworks, which is where she is today. So again, we've got multiple panelists in one, looking at the early stage in terms of startups, growth stage, acquisitions, being acquired, and then obviously from the position of various the board seat vantage point. So Stacy, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to talk to you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for the nice intro. It's nice to be here.
Okay, so let's just set the stage quickly for the conversation. This person quote has been coming up a lot lately because as people talk about workplace equity and they put it in context with things like the EU Directive on Pay Transparency, which recently passed after being debated for a decade, and it has tremendous implications for any global company, including disclosure around things like career progression. The Illinois state law that recently passed a couple of weeks ago also has extended disclosures around opportunity, not just pay transparency. So this landscape is changing really fast. And I think one thing that remains that Burson really speaks to over and over again is that the equity experience in your company for your people is one of the most important parts of your performance. And we're going to be talking about that today. How does equity impact the true ROI? So how do you make sure that you can speak to why this should be a priority and continue to be a priority in your organization? So just a couple of the background stats on productivity, innovation, and retention. So Stacy's going to speak to some of this from a personal perspective in terms of her leadership and how she's experienced it. But if you look at these statistics just in general, and we've got the sources down there at the bottom, so when you get access to this deck, you can see where all of this came from. But employees who work in a high fairness environment have a 26% higher performance and a 27% lower chance of quitting. And it just kind of makes sense. I mean, when you think about this era of transparency, you think about the fact that every new job posting that we put out there has to include a salary range. Do your people trust that salary range is accurate? Do they trust that it's fair? Do they see that salary range and see in the reflection and understand why they're paid what they're paid and why they're in the place in range that they are? So that trust really becomes more important as this era of transparency continues to push forward. And especially now that it's starting to include things like, why was this person promoted, and that career progression element. So there's a 1.2% productivity increase when at least 3 women are on board. So that's another statistic that I think is just really interesting in terms of that ROI of workplace equity. And then innovation is 6 times higher at organizations with the most, let's call it, equal workplace cultures. And you can see the source there again. But just this idea that when people feel they're being treated fairly, they come to work with a different attitude, with a different approach to their productivity and their engagement. So on the business performance side, these are a little bit of a different flavor. So if you think about, when we're talking about business performance, this is looking more at companies that are disclosing and are getting more into that pay transparency piece. So there's an 8% higher mean return on equity for companies that disclose they've conducted a pay equity analysis. So the bunch of stuff there, and again, the sources are linked at the bottom. So when we send out this deck, you'll get all of the sources. But Just Capital did another look at the Russell 1000 and found that companies that even committed to disclosing their pay equity numbers were seeing improved business performance as far as their stock price. So I think there's some interesting connections there. There's a 3% increase in revenue for every 1% increase in gender diversity, and teams that shift to even gender representation generate 41% more revenue. Okay, so those are just some of the stats that lay the groundwork. We did a LinkedIn Live a couple of months ago, and we'll drop the link in the chat here. And that one was with Kim Lupo from Walmart. She leads total compensation and global rewards. And many of these stats, if you're interested in hearing another personal anecdote on sort of how those play out in the workplace, please feel free to go give that a listen. It's about a 25-minute conversation, but she really speaks to this connection again to business performance. And I think that's what we'll be talking about primarily today. Is a lot of this stuff seems kind of squishy, kind of esoteric, sort of culture oriented and aimed at increasing productivity, but a lot of that stuff feels hard to quantify. So we really want to have a conversation around that. So Stacy, we kind of talked about this already at the beginning, but you're approaching this from a very unique vantage point because you've got the marketing and comms, which is how you grew up, but then you've also been a CEO, you're sitting on multiple boards. And so would love to just start out by hearing from you around what's been some of the biggest impact on these organizations that you've worked for, worked with, acquired, been acquired by, in terms of engaging in workplace equity initiatives. So like, what have you seen as the value?
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing specific numbers. It's always good to see them. Sometimes I feel like, oh, it's actually a lot more than that. That's just what we can measure. But I know we all like the metrics. I would love to just talk about what's behind those metrics. Like, why does it actually matter? I'll tell a few stories. You mentioned my background, and yes, I've been a CEO. I am a board member. I currently am a CMO, and at my heart is marketing. And I absolutely subscribe to empathetic marketing. And again, a word that sounds squishy, but what we mean by empathetic marketing is really understanding people and what drives them. And when you're marketing something, that is what you're doing. You're trying to figure out, what does my audience care about? What drives them? And then you are trying to position what you sell in order to make it appealing to them. Why does diversity matter? There aren't a lot of companies in this world that are only selling to a very small demographic of, call it white males or whatever you want to call it. There's virtually no company that is only selling to that demographic. And if you want to truly be successful as a company, you need representative voices that can be empathetic with that demographic that you're selling to. I remember when I first started watching Mad Men. You guys remember Mad Men? And, of course, the shocking part of Mad Men was just was just the lack of diversity in that era. And, I think a lot of our parents lived in that era. And so it's not totally surprising to us. But I just kept watching that show and thinking, you got a bunch of men trying to advertise to women. It's so ridiculous, And so for me, it's like as simple as that. It seems simple, but it's as simple as that. We're all trying to achieve something. Our audience is full of diverse people in diverse environments. Why wouldn't we want people on the team that have a true understanding of that? And that to me is at the core of why diversity matters and why it matters to the bottom line. I'm sitting here in Lafayette, California. If you wanted to sell something to all of the people in Lafayette, California, would you call someone that's living in Munich? No, you would want me to weigh in and say, yes, I think this is what people in Lafayette, California want. It's that simple. It's representative voices. That's point one. Point two is, I think, a little more controversial. And, when I write articles, sometimes this is where I get all the comments. But I do think, it is a fact. And I wrote an article a few years ago it's on Fast Company, titled, your company needs more women, but do you know why? I'll put it in the link. But I did a bunch of research. So Daniel Goleman, who's the leading expert in emotional intelligence, literally documented that girls develop language earlier than boys, and they use that to their advantage as they resolve conflict. Let's talk about conflict. Conflict doesn't necessarily mean I'm in an argument. Conflict can sometimes mean two people in a room, in a boardroom, in an executive room, making decisions. Women do it differently. I'll never forget, we were in our very early days at ServiceMax, and I write about this in the article. We got a low Gartner analyst ranking, and you get the preview. So you get to know in advance what your ranking is going to be. And ours was low, and it was unfair. And it should have been higher. And I remember I was the only woman on the executive team. And I remember that it was just this like, how dare he? And someone needs to call him and tell him why he's wrong. And we got to light him up. Maybe we should go over his head. And I remember just sitting there thinking, okay, we're teeny little startup. We don't even rank enough for him to give us consideration. And he's a Gartner analyst. This is not going to go well. Like, why not take a different approach? And, how about if I reach out to him and try to have a conversation, try to work with him? I'm trying to think about where he's sitting. He's trying to get research out, right? I'm trying to be empathetic to him. And it doesn't always happen. And I'm not trying to say that men are never empathetic. So please don't misconstrue that. But there is a truth to the fact that women approach things differently. And it's not just women, men, it's people from all demographics approach things differently. Sometimes let's go right at it sometimes that is the right approach. Sometimes hey, let's be a little more empathetic is the right approach. Sometimes the woman wants to go at it. Sometimes the man wants to be more empathetic. It's the diversity of views of how to attack something is what will help drive a better result. And that's what's behind all the numbers. It's that ability to have those voices to represent the audience better. And that's when you just have better outcomes. And that's why I say, I think the numbers are actually probably even bigger than what you say, what you shared. I'm not questioning your numbers. I just think the impact is massive. And I think a lot of us feel it when we're in more diverse teams. We feel the power of that diversity.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And what's interesting to me is, we've been getting a ton of questions lately from our customers and from potential customers. And Burson actually wrote an article about this in July, which we can drop in the chat. I thought it was an excellent synopsis of it. But around the Supreme Court's decision about using race as a criterion in selection. And so then, the follow-up was a bunch of attorneys general sent letters to Fortune 500 CEOs telling them, they've got to look at their diversity practices. And mostly those CEOs ignored those letters because they were template letters. But the case relates to using race as a criterion for admission to colleges. And so now there's challenges to diversity programs. But what's interesting about what we do at Syndio and what our customers are doing, and what you talk about a lot, Stacy, is that we're looking to eradicate gender and race bias. And with our solutions, companies are measuring what they're doing in terms of how to achieve goals. There's never a recommendation to favor or disfavor someone in hiring or promotion or termination because of race or gender. The solution's agnostic. You measure it. You don't use it as a criterion. So I think, where we see imbalance or where customers see imbalance, they focus on their practices. Are the practices inclusive? Are they fair? And, you can aspire to look like America, but you must look like your qualified applicant pool. So if you want to change how you're hiring, you've got to change where you're looking and where you're sourcing. So I think this all comes back to reinforcing what you're saying, and then also reinforcing that looking and measuring yourself against your progress is not a bad thing. This is not using something as a criterion. It's very different. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that because I know that's very much in the minds of a lot of folks these days.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's still this check the box mentality that happens of like, okay, now I got to report on this. I better figure out how to report on this. And it's sort of empty, which is why I'm a real advocate for helping people understand why it matters. And, the checking of the box is not the point. The point is that it drives your business. And that's why we should want to do it. Right. And you get into these sticky situations where I just had one maybe 6 months ago where we had two candidates and one was diverse and the other had really, really strong domain expertise that was going to help us execute faster. And we had to evaluate which one's going to help our business, not which one's going to check our box. It was very obvious that the diverse candidate was going to check a box, but also like I got a job to do and I need to perform. And so the decision is made about who's the best candidate for the role. And sometimes the diverse candidate, like that diversity helps drive. And sometimes there are other factors that come into play. And I think when you take I got to check a box out of it and you focus on, I understand diversity drives performance. And that's why I'm often making a diverse choice, not just because I'm checking a box.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it in terms of like you're reframing it. You're using that like marketing comms expertise to frame it differently. And so I want to go back to something you wrote in 2017. So, and hopefully we can drop this in the chat. So in a 2017 Quartz article, you stated that your perspective as a CEO has helped you understand, I'm going to quote you, that if we're serious about equal pay, individual solutions aren't the answer. We need broader structural change. Can you tell us more about your experience and what types of changes you've seen orgs make that have had the greatest impact? And I want to keep this trend going that you're consistently talking about not just the employees, but also the business and the bottom line.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah, and I think if you read the article, I spoke from a personal experience um, as a CEO, and I was the CEO of a small company. It was the first time I had a purview to salaries across the entire company. Okay, so I had always, as a CMO, I always knew the salaries of my own team, but it was the first time that I could look at my whole company as a whole and see salaries as a whole. It was the first time that I was negotiating, not me personally, but I was part of the negotiation for job offers in the engineering team, which, 9 times out of 10 is a man. In marketing, it's a lot more women, right? I came from a more balanced team into the purview. I'm interviewing candidates left and right to join our engineering org. And I was like, every single time the man asks for more, every time they get their offer, they ask for more. Literally never. In my experience at that company, literally never did a female engineer negotiate. It was always, thank you very much for the offer. I'd love to join. And it just jumped out at me. And then the flip side is, like, we were an early stage VC backed company with a finite amount of runway, which meant every single dollar mattered, right? So if somebody isn't coming asking for more, it's pretty easy to not give them more because I'm watching every dollar. And I found my own self in that situation of perpetuating a wage gap problem. Because it was easy to pay the woman less, I was paying the woman less. And that is where we need structural change. Now, obviously, I'm looking at that and I'm changing my practices, right? And I can do that. It was my own company. I can set salary bands. I can even out the teams. I can do that because I notice it and I care, and I had 30 people in my company, so I could see it. But how often is that happening where there's no system, there's no process, there's just I'm going to only pay what I have to pay. And if someone's not negotiating, I'm not giving him more money. And if I got to get that guy on board because hiring's tight and he wants another 10 grand, I'm going to give him the 10 grand. Suddenly I've got a whole slew of people that are paid inaccurately. And that's why the systems matter and the processes matter, because if it was hard for me to put a stop to the wage gap issues, imagine how easy it is across industries to just continue. And that's just one example, right? I mean, negotiation is evolving, and I think women are getting a lot better at it. There's a lot of talk about how do we stop the wage gap, right? But I'm just giving an example of it's actually pretty hard to do it as a practice unless you have a structural system that enables it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we talk about all the time with our customers is that, all of these programs targeted at women and people of color to teach them how to negotiate better are nice, but it's incumbent upon the employer to ensure that they don't have systemic bias embedded in their systems and that they have pay disparities because of something like gender, race, or the intersectionality of those things. And so I think you've got to, as an employer, make sure that you're analyzing this stuff, because the other side of it is, as you mentioned, starting pay is the biggest factor in any pay equity analysis. And so if you go into it with that start low, stay low mentality, the folks that are being started lower it's going to take them, it compounds over time. It's going to take them so much more time to catch up. So I think that's really important, as you're saying, you've got to have systems, you've got to be using technology, you've got to be doing pay equity analysis and not just kind of sticking your finger in the air and saying, are we fair? Do we have disparities? Like, you've got to be actually looking at the numbers. So I think that's exactly right. And I love your take on kind of the negotiation is a symptom and you can solve for the symptom, but it's really up to the organization to be accountable.
Yeah, and
So
just another quick point on that. I mean, I'm
no,
all for empowerment. If you read any of my stuff, you'll see that I'm not slamming organizations. I'm trying to empower women, right? And there's an aspect, and not women. I mean, my platform happens to be largely skewed toward gender equity, but I mean equity across all demographics. There's certainly things we can do as individuals to better position ourselves in the wage gap. I mean, you look at the women's soccer team. They did that on their own. But I think that that's only going to go so far. And to your point, organizations got to step up and help.
Yeah, and I think, this next question sort of speaks to the buy-in. We also got a question in the chat about what's the best way to introduce a DEI program without feeling the pressure to say yes to all employee feedback, suggestions, and risking a group or person feeling left out. And, personally, you've dealt with this as a CEO. I've dealt with this as a CEO. I think honestly for me, and then I want to hear your answer for that one, and then we'll talk about kind of buy-in. The best way is to say no to some things and to explain it broadly and explain why you're saying no. Because if you say yes to everything, ultimately you're going to be doing a disservice to somebody, and you just can't keep that up. So I think it's good for employees, honestly, in the vein of transparency, to hear what you didn't do as much as what you will do, and sort of why and what your philosophy is around that.
Yeah, I do think it's hard. There's a lot of things that honestly are hard about implementing a good DEI program. And I know we're all still living them and figuring them out as we go. And nothing's perfect, especially as this is evolving so quickly. But I do think if you are, first of all, inclusive in, like, we have a really active women's 360. We call it the Freshworks Women's 360 group. It's very active on Slack. It has a budget. It has a leadership team. So there are people that are grassroots. It's not run by me. It's not run by HR. It's a rotating leadership position from people in the organization. It's very grassroots, but it has a mission. It has a charter. It has a list of things that the group will do. I think primarily it's a Slack group for conversation. It's also, we do events, and I shouldn't even say we, it is very much run by that ERG. But there is a place you can go that clearly says, this is what the charter is, and this is what we do. And I think that is what gives you the ability to say, that's just not something that we can take on, right? Or that's not part of our charter. Happy to talk about it. I mean, we had, when, parental leave is always a hot topic in any company, and the women's 360, like, it was a very active Slack group as the new policies for the new year were rolling out. And there was certainly some facilitation from the women's 360 group to the HR team and even the executive team on, hey, let's talk about some of the areas where we're concerned, and you should hear us out. But the women's 360 was very clear in their charter. Like, it's not their job to define the parental leave policy, right? It's an ERG with a voice, and the voice can be raised, but we shouldn't be holding that ERG accountable for something like that. So the more you can document the roles and responsibilities, the mission, then it makes it easier to say, hey, that's just not part of our charter for this year. Happy to take it up next year.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because you're also having to communicate exactly what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, as we kind of talked about earlier. But it's clear, it's transparent, and it's direct. And I think employees really appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit more about exec buy-in, because it plays a big role in any initiative. So you've been a CEO, you've been probably pushing these types of initiatives. You've probably been on the other side where people have been pushing them to you. So any advice for total rewards folks, HR folks who want to start pushing this, or maybe moving from sort of a static, backward looking, reactive analysis to getting more proactive and looking at sort of root cause and ongoing, like how would you advise people in terms of getting this in front of your executive team?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been personally in that position because I've always been part of the executive team that believes in it. And frankly, one of the things I talk about in some of my articles is like there are ways you can figure out if an executive team is on board that this matters. And if they're not, maybe you don't want to be there. Now we all don't have the luxury of being super picky about our jobs, but for me, I have not had an experience of working in a company where this wasn't on the agenda of the executive team, because I wouldn't join a company where this wasn't on the agenda of the executive team. So that's step one, which is why I don't have as much personal experience with trying to get it on the agenda. I will say I've been in this industry for over 30 years, and DEI was not a term that existed. I worked at Oracle in the 90s. And I mean, I could tell a lot of stories about what it was like in those days. It was more often trying to fight an unfair environment versus trying to get DEI on the agenda. But I would say find those that believe in it. And again, not those that believe in, yeah, we better get that box checked because either A, we're going to have to report on it publicly, or, our board cares, or it's a good look for hiring. Let's say it on our, hiring page. That sort of empty box checking isn't going to get it really on the agenda. I would say find the executives in the org, or, one layer down from the executive team that really believe it matters, and have those voices help you shape it and take it to the remainder of the executive team and say, here's why we want to introduce this. It isn't about checking a box. It's because we truly believe we're going to drive company performance through this diversity and examples, right? Like, here's how we saw that this helped us. Like, we had a much more effective campaign when so-and-so ran it because look at our audience, right? Like, draw those conclusions. But I think having an advocate or two that have a seat at the table helps bring that issue to the table.
Yeah, and that flows right into our next question, which is, you've got to be prepared with some of the metrics around why it makes sense for companies to continue to invest in this. So when you think about, you've got a limited budget, you've got limited resources, you just made a really strong case, even with your Mad Men example, in terms of, you've got to know who you're marketing to and you have to understand the audience. Like, what are some things that you think about as you would push to continue investing in this, even when resources are tight?
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. Like, in the last year, everything's getting cut, right? And I don't mean everything's getting cut, but everything's getting looked at with a microscope, right? Whether it's like, we got to take half of our tech stack out because we're spending money on software that we're not using, layoffs are happening left and right. I think we're in a different environment, and costly programs get looked at. And I think, again, it's about ROI. And if the company believed, hey, I'm implementing this program, or I'm implementing this technology that helps deliver diversity, that was just a nice to have, and I don't really have to report on that. So let's just sideline that. It goes back to the inherent problem of, did you do it because you just thought it was what everyone else is doing and you should check a box, or did you do it because you really thought it would drive performance? I mean, when resources are scarce, again, you want things that are going to perform. And if you truly believe that diversity helps performance, then you would never cut that program. If you think it's just a nice to have and you just can cut it, I don't know, maybe that's not where I want to be dedicating my efforts. Again, I say that, and I know we don't all have the luxury of just quitting our jobs and going to work at a place where diversity is valued, but it goes to the inherent. I think that's where we still, as a civilization, have work to do, which is getting people to understand that it drives results. Diversity drives results. It isn't just like life's unfair or check this box. It truly drives results. And then when times are tough, I'm doubling down because I really need to perform.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting from your vantage point, one of the things that you mention often that people do understand is the reputational risk. So I think, it's interesting. Workplace equity, pay equity in particular, is one of those things where it feels like a nice to have until it's not. And the moment it's not, meaning the moment you identify a plaintiff or the moment you realize you've got something brewing because you're looking at Glassdoor or Blind and everybody's exchanging their pay and they're starting to figure some things out or share Google spreadsheets, all of a sudden that goes from, this perception of nice to have to your hair's on fire real quick. So I think that's the other side of this is, you've got to believe in what you're talking about, which is, attracting talent and innovation and prioritizing this link to business performance. But it's also that reputational risk, which, it's going to, as we stated in the beginning, the early stats about driving employees sort of trust and engagement. But the flip side of that is if it goes wrong, it goes wrong. It goes terribly wrong.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the sincerity of the program, right? Am I implementing this program because my Glassdoor is preventing me from hiring? Because nobody wants to come work at my company that has bad Glassdoor ratings. Like the internet is in many ways a beautiful thing, right? Because if I am just doing it just for those reasons, I mean, I guess we can all be happy that it happens, but if it's the first thing that gets cut when times get tough, then that's a problem. My hope is that whatever it takes, like if it's poor Glassdoor reviews, which force the non-believers to believe it, and we have more diverse workforces, the performance comes and then people become believers. It's just, we're still in a time of evolution, right? I mean, you and I are sitting here talking about this. In the last 10 years, there are a lot more CEOs of big public companies that are believers. I mean, we have come a long way, no question. I look back to my time at Oracle when, Oracle was a progressive company, a modern company, and I'm talking in the 90s. And I can remember going to the big sales kickoff where you bring all the whole sales team together and there was one female on the stage. Now that still happens, but it happens a lot less. Like we have come a long way. I wouldn't have ever dreamed that I could be a CEO in 1992 because I'd never seen one. Never. There was no female CEO in my sphere. Now there were a few, but not that many. It's very different now. We have a lot of examples, not enough, but I think we're coming along. I think I have a lot of optimism that the sincerity with which we do these programs will become more and more the reason that companies do them versus just I'm told I have to for my Glassdoor reviews.
Yeah. So two more questions. One, we're going to talk about digital transformation. I also want to address a question in the chat. So the question is about acquisition, I think, because you've been a part of so many and on both sides. So the question is, what are your views on running a pay equity analysis, including people in a recent acquisition, knowing that on overall there's a premium which ended up in a gap? Should we exclude it? Is it legally defendable? So, I mean, I can answer this quickly. This is not legal advice. But in terms of what we see with our customers, because we have quite a few customers that are acquired or make acquisitions, and you should definitely include them. So there's not a quote, we recently acquired them defense. And actually, it's not unusual for M&A to lead class cases, not immediately, but if those issues linger, there's many, many, many examples of that. A lot of our customers are using our software for pay harmonization purposes. So when incorporating the acquired company into the main org, if that's a goal. So I would just want to be really clear on that, that no, there's not a defense there for recently acquired. I want to make sure I get to that one. As we move into digital transformation, which is obviously always a big part too of combining two entities. So it's a hot topic right now in HR amidst like some of the consolidation that's happening and moving from like multiple point solutions to more consolidated solutions, and then just digital transformation in general in terms of how we're working. So any benefits that you've seen in terms of implementing technology specifically for like the people workplace equity stuff? I mean, what have you seen here in terms of like the journey of digital transformation?
Yeah, and I can tie to some of the comments in the chat about let's just talk about wage as an example. And I talked about how it was easy for me to see the discrepancy because I had a small team and I literally could put my whole team on one spreadsheet and I could see, wow, all of these engineers are making this much and my one female engineer is making less. I need to fix that. When you run a company with thousands of employees, that's not easy to do. And it's not easy to give visibility down to manager level, and it's not easy to take the action and show the impact of just the wage, right? And leveling is always a hot topic. The topic of, well, you have people in the company already, but now you're hiring new people and the market has increased. So what do you do? And I can tell you from an executive perspective, that's a really hard thing to do. It's easy to just think, okay, well, the market is now, I can't get this person hired because the market is much higher. So I'll just hire them at the new price and I'm going to bring all the rest of the people up to their price. Like that is not an easy thing to do when you're managing a P&L and when resources are tight. Like it poses very challenging decisions, and systems can often help with those decisions of like, how do I handle this across lots and lots of hiring situations and lots of wages? That's where it gets challenging. It's easy to manage when you've got 30 people in your company. When you have thousands and you have all kinds of things you're trying to manage, you need something that's there to guide you, to surface the discrepancies, to help you report on your progress in addressing the discrepancies. It's like anything else. Automation and technology are absolute helpers in running things that matter. And this area is no different.
We talk about that a lot in terms of having a solution. You're never going to remove discretion from decision making, particularly for managers. That's part of the job, but you need something that's going to guide the discretion in real time. So it's going to give you recommended ranges. It's going to help you stay within range. It's going to indicate whether your policies are potentially biased, and it's going to guide that discretion in real time, which I think is really important, because without that, where is the North Star? I think it's very, very subjective in a lot of cases, especially as you think about things like performance reviews. So before we move to our last question for you, Stacy, there's one audience question here that says, what time frame do you recommend as meaningful as a snapshot for measuring our company's equity ROI? One challenge we see is that many equity changes take time to meaningfully implement, but the emphasis is on now for demonstrating ROI. This is a great question, and it's one we see all the time, because on the pay equity side of what we do, pay equity, you can remediate, you can throw money at it, and you can get to dollar for dollar. All it takes are dollars. On the unadjusted pay gap side, if you're really trying to make progress against that unadjusted pay gap, meaning, all like you talked about at Oracle, like all the men are up here and all the women are down here, that takes time because you're looking at movement, promotion, you're looking at where are the opportunities, what are the development look like, what about, learning and development, how are you training folks? And so I think on the opportunity side, it's really sort of now trailing 2 years, but it really depends on turnover and how tenured your people are. So that's something, happy to take that conversation offline and sort of answer the questions more specifically if you want to reach out. But that's kind of my thought. Any thoughts from you, Stacey, on just
I
like
do.
the time frame you like to see?
Well, I don't have a thought on a specific time frame, but I will tell you, any marketer on this call is very used to this scenario. I'm spending the money today on a campaign or a lead generation effort. I still got to bring in the leads after the leads get worked, they get nurtured, they turn into an opportunity. The opportunity gets worked by a sales team. The sales team moves it along in, 7 stages of a sales cycle. You move into negotiation, the deal gets closed, you see the revenue. It can be a year later. This is not a new concept for senior leaders. They just need to be reminded. Some things take time. You start with the strategy, you execute on the campaign doesn't bring results. So I think the most important part is don't sign up for immediate results. When you propose the program, when you ask for the budget or the resources to implement the program, lay out the timeframes for success and sign up for that. And I mean, literally, marketing teams have been doing it for decades. I run an event, and even right now, we're funneling some more money into some of our field marketing campaigns. And I have to very clearly say, this is when it will generate pipeline. This is when it will generate revenue. It's not tomorrow, people. So I would say don't sign up for it. Show a very clear plan. The ROI should be whatever you believe the ROI is because you've done your homework. There's no set time frame. What my sales cycle at Freshworks is very different from other sales cycles. It's very unique to the program, but I would say just be clear about what you believe the ROI timeframe is and set that expectation because it is not a new concept for leaders.
I love that. I love tying it to another part of functional, it is. That's the bread and butter of what marketing leadership is always doing. So last question that really leans on your communications expertise. So with all this legislation and employee demands around pay transparency and the salary ranges and now career progression as part of the Illinois law and the EU directive, we're seeing organizations struggle to figure out how do they communicate workplace equity, like the efforts, the progress, where they are on the journey, and getting those communications right. It's super important. What are some successful strategies you've seen around this in terms of communicating and pick, with employees, with leadership, with the board, investors, the public, any or all?
Okay, sorry, 1 second. I was busy I wrote an article about, it's not remote work, but it was COVID, to another question that was asked. So I just answered it. Communication. Again, I go back to make sure you have senior leadership sponsorship. And that's, I think, how you create the time and space for the communication. I mean, at Freshworks, we have a lot of advocates for diversity on our leadership team, and because of that, it means we're making room for, hey, this initiative's getting presented first to the executive leadership team and refining and getting buy-in and making room for now, how is it, are we doing it in an all hands? Are we going group by group? Can we do it in person? But I think getting like as high as you can start from that, getting buy-in, and then the room is made. I also go back to some of the other things we talked about, really clearly define the strategy, but also why it matters, what the time frame is for the ROI. And I think the more it's brought to that level of the way an organization thinks or a leadership team thinks, which is, I'm doing this for a reason. And the reason is that it drives performance, and keeping that thread through that communication of like, why does this matter? It doesn't matter because I'm trying to be fair to certain demographics. That's a great side benefit. It matters because it's going to help my company be more successful. And the more you tie it to that, the more people can rally behind it.
I love that. To close out, any last pieces of advice? Our audience tends to really like sort of actionable pieces of advice to close out in terms of either thinking about how to communicate ROI around workplace equity, or if you were to give them sort of like, here's the top thing to keep in mind as you go out on this journey. Like, what would your big piece of advice be?
Oh gosh. I guess my biggest piece of advice, well, I have two. I have one for individuals and one for people that are really, taking this on for organizations. My advice for individuals is, do not view this as obstacles, view it as opportunities. And I like to tell the story of, I don't know if anybody mountain bikes, but when you're mountain biking, you do not look at the big rock that is on the side as you're coming up to it. And you definitely do not look to the cliff that's on your left that if you take a wrong turn, you might go flying down. You look at the road ahead. And when you focus on the road ahead and the opportunities, that is where you go. It's also like throwing a ball. Sorry for all the sports out analogies, but you have to point your hand where you want the ball to go. If you point your hand over there, it doesn't go there. So point your attention at where you can go and what the opportunities are, and don't focus on obstacles. I never had a feeling of, I'm never going to be a CEO because I'm a woman. I'll never get that job. They're not going to consider me because the barriers are too hard for me. I always felt like, why not? I mean, I can do it. Like, I focused on, I'm going to go, prove them wrong or whatever it is. And not how many obstacles I had to go through to get it. So that's my advice to individuals. My advice to companies, as what we've been talking about for the last hour, tie it to performance, tie it to why it matters to the business, not why it matters to our emotional sense of fairness or wanting to do good for people in society. Those are also incredibly valuable. But the point of most companies is to drive success, and for many of them, drive profit. And this helps that. And the more we can very, very clearly articulate why it is doing that, go find examples. Go look for a team in the org that's really diverse and look at what they've accomplished. Go find a team in the org that's not very diverse and look at what they've accomplished. I would be shocked if the first isn't performing better than the second, because I know that diversity matters. So that's, I guess, my advice is, go find how it correlates to performance and bring that to light, because that's how everybody's going to get on board with this. And it's really the true reason to do it.
Awesome. Well, Stacy, thank you so much. It was great having you. I think hearing all of your different perspectives and just your personal anecdotes, I think you gave us a lot to think about and to take action on. So for all of you in the audience, we will be sending out this deck with a link to the recording. So that will be coming to you in an email after this. And thank you, Stacy, so much for your time and for being here.
Yeah, it was great. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.